There is a man lying back across the hood of a car, and he is dead. His name does not matter much. He runs a fancy restaurant, and he has just collapsed, and the show holds on his body for a moment. His eyes are open and empty, fixed on nothing. A long-serving fork slips out of his fingers and clatters somewhere out of frame. The lighting does not change. No music swells to tell you that something terrible has happened. A child watching this at home understands instantly, without being told, exactly what they are looking at. They are looking at a corpse. That is the version of the scene that aired in the United States. In a great deal of the rest of the world, a child watching the same episode saw the same body and the same light with the same blank eyes and heard, very faintly, the sound of breathing. Somebody, somewhere, in an edit suite far from the people who actually made this show, had recorded the sound of a man breathing and laid it underneath the shot of a man who was visibly not. The falling fork was cut, the breath was added, and the corpse, for the benefit of children in another country, was quietly brought back to life by a sound effect. Think about what that actually means. Think about the meeting that had to happen for that to exist. This is a video about the two versions of regular show. There is the one its creators made, and there is the one a great deal of the world was permitted to see, and the distance between them is enormous, far larger than most people who grew up with this show will ever know. Episodes were cut, episodes were banned outright. Some were sliced nearly in half. And when you line up every single change that was made, across every country, across 8 years on the air, one subject comes up again and again, more than the swearing, more than the innuendo, more than the violence. The thing the world kept trying to take out of regular show was death. Welcome to Velvo. Get comfortable and settle in, because this one goes deep. Let us get into it. To understand why a man breathing on a car matters, you first have to understand the size of the thing that made him breathe. Regular Show was created by J.G. Quintel and produced by Cartoon Network Studios. It premiered on Cartoon Network on the 6th of September 2010, and it ended on the 16th of January 2017. Across those years, it ran for 8 seasons and more than 240 episodes, which makes it one of the longest-running and most successful original series in the network's history. It was built out of a pilot Quintel made for a scrapped anthology project called the Cartoon Institute, and its central characters came out of 2 short films he made as a student, one of them called 2 in the AM PM, and the other called The Naive Man from Lollyland. Before it was Regular Show, it was very nearly called Normal Show, and the word normal is one to hold on to, because it is the joke the entire series is built on. The premise is ordinary on purpose. 2 friends in their early 20s, Mordecai and Rigby, a blue jay and a raccoon, work as groundskeepers at a park. They are supposed to rake leaves and set up chairs and keep the grass cut. They mostly do not. Their boss is Benson, a gumball machine with a very short temper. Their co-workers include Skips, a yeti, Pops, a gentle lollipop-headed man, Muscle Man, and a small floating ghost called High Five Ghost. Mordecai is voiced by Quintel himself, Rigby is voiced by William Salyers. Sam Marin voices Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man, 3 completely different people out of one throat. And Skips the Yeti is voiced by Mark Hamill, a piece of casting that on its own tells you something about the kind of show this wanted to be. The ordinariness is the setup. The punchline is that nothing in this park stays ordinary for more than about 4 minutes. A simple chore becomes a portal. A coffee run becomes a chase through another dimension. A bet over a video game becomes a fight against a god. The writers built the show on that exact rhythm every time. A small, recognizable, almost boring problem, and then a sudden swerve into the supernatural, the cosmic, the genuinely dangerous. Quintel has said the humor came partly out of British television he fell in love with through a roommate at art school. Comedies like The Mighty Boosh and The League of Gentlemen, shows that were strange and dark and entirely unafraid of the grotesque. That sensibility is stitched into everything Regular Show ever did. It is why a children's cartoon about a park has a recurring character who is literally Death, and why Death rides a motorcycle and speaks with a thick British accent. We will come back to him. We will come back to him more than once. Here is the part that matters most for this video. Regular Show was rated TV-PG, and the episodes with violence in them were rated TV-PGV. It was, in fact, the first Cartoon Network animated comedy to carry that violence rating at all. That is a small administrative detail, and it is also the whole story. This was a show airing in the afternoon, in a block aimed squarely at children, that the network's own rating system flagged as containing material a parent might want to think about first. The people making it knew precisely what they were doing. Years later, talking to Variety in 2026 around the show's revival, Quintel said the quiet part out loud. He said that at one point, Cartoon Network had told the writers to tone it down. He described how the characters would get completely sloppily drunk on soda and hot wings, because real alcohol was off the table, so the team simply built a workaround in plain sight. And he looked back on those early seasons and said, more or less, that he could not believe the network had ever greenlit it in the first place. How did they let us do this? That is the creator of the show, speaking about his own show, still slightly amazed. So what you have is a series that is, in its bones, an adult comedy wearing the badge of a children's network. And that contradiction did not stay quietly inside the writer's room. It went out over the air into millions of homes in dozens of countries, and a great many of those countries looked at what Cartoon Network in America had approved and decided that it was not in fact acceptable for their children. This is where the second version of the show comes from. In the United Kingdom, in Australia, in the Philippines, in New Zealand, in parts of Latin America, were run through a filter first. Sometimes that filter was light, often it was not. The categories the censors worked from were strikingly consistent from country to country: profanity, innuendo, violence, and death. Mild swearing was scrubbed almost everywhere. The common word for excrement became, in the British broadcast, the gentler crud. A coarser word for being angry got swapped out for whatever the censors felt like that particular week, sometimes ticked, sometimes miffed. For a long stretch of the early seasons, the British feed even objected to the word moron and replaced it every single time it appeared with idiot. Innuendo was trimmed or rewritten line by line. Violence was softened in 100 tiny ways. A punch became a shove, a machine gun became a cannon, a fist connecting with the face became a fist that swings while the moment of contact is quietly removed. And then there was death, which is the one this video is about, and which received more attention from the censors than any of the other categories combined. The genuinely strange thing, the thing that makes this more than a long list of cuts, is that the editing did not stop at the border. At some point around 2013 and 2014, Cartoon Network in the United States went back into its own older episodes and quietly began editing those too. Lines that had aired uncut in America for years were suddenly different in reruns. A coarse word in the first season episode about the talking hot dogs became milder. Language in the very first episode of the series was trimmed down. Viewers noticed and were confused and asked the obvious question the same one Quintel asked, "This is a TV PG show. The network approved it. The network rated it. So why is the network now going back and sanding it down?" The most honest answer anyone could ever find was that somebody complained. And the network got nervous, and a show that had been allowed to be exactly what it was began retroactively to be carved into something safer. That is The Machine, a long-running, enormously popular, deliberately adult cartoon, and a global apparatus of broadcasters quietly rewriting it as it aired, each according to its own particular set of nerves. Most people who loved this show only ever saw one version of it, whichever one their country let them have, and never once knew the other existed. When you gather all of those changes together and ask what they were most afraid of, the answer is not the one you would guess. It is not the swearing, which is mild. It is not the innuendo, which is constant but cartoonish and obvious. It is not even the violence, a great deal of which somehow survived intact. It is death, and the reason cuts to the heart of this entire subject. Because to understand why the censors were so fixated on death in this particular show, you have to understand a fact that the show itself never announced and never needed to. Death was not a guest in regular show. Death lived there. That is the shape of the thing we are looking at then. A show built to be much more than it was allowed to be, and a world that kept trying to shrink it back down to size. But to feel why death sat at the very center of all of it, you have to go back to the episode where Death first walked into the park. And it is no accident at all that the episode where Death arrives is also one of the most heavily cut episodes in the entire series. Those two facts are the same fact. That is what this next part is about. There is a moment in the second season where Skips the Immortal Yeti is sitting across an arm wrestling table from Rigby, and Skips pins his arm, and Rigby's head snaps down against the table, and Rigby dies. That is not a misreading. That is what happens. The episode is called Over the Top. It aired in 2011, and its title is a direct reference to the 1987 Sylvester Stallone film about competitive arm wrestling. The setup is exactly as small and stupid as the show likes its setups to be. There is an arm wrestling competition. Mordecai and Rigby want to win it. There is a bar, and there is bragging, and there is the kind of escalating one-upmanship that drives half the plots in this series. And in the middle of all that comedy, Skips and Rigby arm wrestle, and Skips, who does not know his own strength, slams Rigby down hard enough that the impact kills him. The screen does not soften it. Rigby is dead on the floor. And then a man arrives on a motorcycle to collect him. This is Death, and his entrance is one of the most purely confident pieces of character design the show ever produced. He is a skeleton, more or less, with thin greenish flaps of skin still clinging to the bone, arranged on his face so that they read almost like a mustache and sideburns. He has brown hair down to his neck. He wears a black motorcycle jacket over a torn shirt that does not quite hide his ribcage, blue jeans, a belt with a skull on the buckle, a small chain hanging from his back pocket. One of his arms is normal. The other, his right, is enormous, grotesquely muscled, completely out of proportion with the rest of him. He speaks in a thick British accent, voiced by Julian Holloway, and his whole look was modeled in part on Lemmy Kilmister, the frontman of the band Motorhead, and on a violent intergalactic biker from comic books. When he wants a soul, he says, essentially, that the soul is now his, a line lifted straight from a fighting video game. He is, in other words, a heavy metal album cover that became the literal Grim Reaper, and the show drops him into a story about an arm wrestling tournament without a flicker of hesitation. Watch what the episode does with him, because it is the key to everything. Death does not arrive to frighten anyone. Death arrives to do a job. He has come for Rigby's soul because Rigby has died, and that is simply how the process works. And Skips, who has known Death for a very long time, does the most regular show thing imaginable. He challenges Death to an arm wrestling match for Rigby's soul. The literal embodiment of mortality, the thing every horror film in history has built itself around. And the show's response is to sit him down at a table and beat him in a bar game. Skips wins. Death, furious, honors the bet anyway because Death always honors his bets, and he brings Rigby back to life, and he swears that one day he will have his revenge, and he rides off. Rigby is alive again. The episode ends. Everyone goes back to work. Now think about the gap here, because the gap is the entire point. In the American version, a children's show casually kills one of its two leads, introduces the personification of death as a recurring character you can defeat at arm wrestling, brings the dead character back through a bet, and treats the whole sequence as comedy. Death is not the villain of this story. Death is barely even an antagonist. He is a guy with a job and a temper and a code of honor, and the show is so unafraid of him that it makes him lose at a table. And the version of this episode that a great deal of the world saw had been taken apart. In the British broadcast, the first 30 seconds or so of the episode were cut completely, which left the opening so disjointed that it jumps straight into the bar without explaining how anyone got there. The bar itself is a problem, because Mordecai and Rigby get drunk in it in the show's usual way, on soda standing in for something stronger, and so the bar's name was scrubbed off the outside of the building and off its door. And a line naming the bar was redubbed so that the characters were heading back into a generic family restaurant instead. A small joke after that line was cut entirely. And then there is the detail that captures the whole philosophy in a single edit. At one point, Death spits into Rigby's mouth, which is part of the revival, a gross and intimate and slightly ridiculous gesture. In the censored version, that was not allowed. So someone animated a new shot of Death firing a laser instead, and the shot of the spit actually reaching Rigby was cut. The censors would permit Death. They would permit the laser. What they could not permit was the spit, the bodily closeness of it, the ungrand and human texture of how this show handles its supernatural. That is the texture the censors kept colliding with, over and over. For 8 years, regular show does not treat death as a horror. It treats death as a body. It treats death as a substance, a process, a guy you might know. And that refusal to make death frightening is precisely what made it impossible to cut cleanly, because the censors were trained to remove fear, and there was no fear here to remove. There was only intimacy, and you cannot snip intimacy out of an episode the way you snip out a scary face. You have to rewrite the whole relationship, and the British editors clearly understood this, because they kept trying scene after scene, year after year, and they never quite managed it. Quintel built death the way he did for a reason that connects all the way back to that British roommate at art school. The comedies he loved, the Mighty Boosh especially, were full of strange, affectionate monsters, death figures, and cosmic beings rendered with warmth and a little absurdity rather than menace. Death in regular show is a direct descendant of that tradition. He is a death you could have a pint with. And a death you could have a pint with is far more subversive on a children's network than a death that screams, because the screaming death confirms what children are supposed to feel, and the drinking death dismantles it. The show was telling children, every time death showed up, that the thing they were taught to be most afraid of had a family and a motorcycle and a soft spot and a sense of humor. The censors were not really cutting violence when they cut these scenes. They were cutting comfort, they were protecting children from being comforted about the one thing children are most afraid of, and they did not seem to notice that this was what they were doing. Death arrives and over the top. He never really leaves after that. And the fact that his introduction is also one of the most surgically dismantled episodes in the series is the show and the censors both telling you, from opposite directions, the same truth. This is what the show is about. This is the thing we cannot allow. Hold both of those in your mind because everything else in this video is the elaboration of that single collision. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Death walks into the park during the second season. But the censors' war on Death in this show did not begin with him. It began earlier than that in the very first season before Death had a face, or a motorcycle, or a name. And it began not with a scene, but with a single word. There is a first season episode called Meet Your Maker. The premise is the kind of thing the show could generate in its sleep. Mordecai and Rigby discover a freezer full of talking hot dogs, and things escalate from there into chaos. Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, Mordecai dies. The show does not dwell on it as a tragedy because in this universe, death is rarely permanent and almost never solemn. But he dies, and then he is brought back, and afterward, Rigby fills him in on what he missed. Rigby tells him, casually, that while he was dead, he found these talking hot dogs. That is the line. Plain, offhand, the way you would tell a friend what happened while they stepped out of the room. While you were dead. In the censored version, the word dead was replaced with the word unconscious. While you were unconscious, I found these talking hot dogs. Sit with how small that changes, and then sit with how completely it gives the game away. Mordecai was not unconscious. He was dead. The show had shown it. He had to be brought back, which is not something you do to an unconscious person. The censored line does not describe what happened in the episode. It describes what the censors wished had happened. And in choosing unconscious, they did something they would do again hundreds of times over the next 6 years. In country after country, they left the death itself completely intact, fully visible on screen, and removed only the word for it. The event was permitted, the noun was not. This is the doctrine in its purest, earliest form, and it appears in the very first season, which tells you that this collision was baked into the show from the beginning. Meet Your Maker was not an outlier. The first season is full of the same friction. The first proper episode of the entire series, called The Power, was edited in several places. A piece of wordplay between Mordecai and Rigby was altered. A line about not looking at each other while synchronizing watches was cut for being too suggestive. And a scene in which the wizard relieves himself in the bushes, with all the unmistakable sound that implies had those sounds quietly stripped out, even though the scene still plainly shows what is happening. The first episode, the show had been on the air for one installment, and the editors were already at work on the body and the bladder and the suggestion. A few episodes later, in Death Punchies, an episode about Rigby learning a ridiculous martial art, there is a montage of Mordecai and Rigby fighting, and at one point, Mordecai kicks Rigby squarely in the crotch. That was not allowed, so the editors reached back to an earlier shot in the same episode of Mordecai simply punching Rigby, and they dropped that punch into the place where the kick had been. The violence stayed. Only the location of the violence on the body was changed, because a kick to the crotch is a body acknowledging that bodies are vulnerable in specific, undignified ways. And the show found that funny, and the censors found it unacceptable. And in Meet Your Maker, again alongside the changed word dead, there is the scene that the show built around its single most reliable workaround. Skips and Benson and Pops sit down together and get completely drunk. Not on alcohol, of course, because alcohol was forbidden. On soda and on hot wings, the exact substitution Quintel described decades later. The scene is staged like every drunk scene in every adult comedy ever made. The slurring and the swaying and the bad ideas. And it is one of the funniest things in the early run, and the only reason it could air at all is that everyone agreed to pretend the soda was doing it. Even that was not safe enough for the censors. They went in and cut the moment where Skips crushes a can against his forehead, the most cartoonishly drunk gesture in the scene, because the gesture was a little too honest about what the soda was standing in for. Step back and look at what the first season alone establishes. This is a show whose ordinary, regular, normal world includes dying as a Tuesday afternoon inconvenience, includes bodies that drink and stagger and get kicked in tender places, includes the wizard going to the bathroom in a bush. The title says regular. The title says normal. And the content underneath the title is a steady, cheerful insistence that regular life is full of death, and appetite, and the body, that these things are not separate from ordinary existence, but are the most ordinary parts of it. That is the actual thesis of regular show, hidden inside its blandest possible name. Ordinary life is the strange and physical and mortal thing. And from the very first episode, somebody somewhere was already at work trying to lift the death and the body back out of it. One word, one sound, one shot at a time, as if the show could be returned to the safe and bloodless ordinariness its name seemed to promise. It could not. The show was never going to let it, but the attempt started immediately, and it never stopped. Which brings us back to the man on the car, the corpse from the very beginning of this video. Because once you understand the doctrine, That the death stays and the acknowledgement goes, that breathing corpse stops being a bizarre one-off and becomes something much more revealing. It becomes the doctrine taken to its logical, almost unbelievable conclusion. The episode is called Fancy Restaurant, and it is from the 3rd season. The restaurant owner is a minor character in the story for only a short while, and near the end of the episode he dies. The death is not gory. He simply collapses backward across a car, and the show holds on him and his eyes are open and empty, and the long-serving fork falls from his hand. There is no music. There is no slow zoom. The show, as it almost always does with death, declines to tell you how to feel. It just lets the body be a body. A child watching the American broadcast saw a dead man and understood it instantly and completely, the way children understand far more than adults give them credit for. In the version that aired in much of the world, the editors faced a problem they had created for themselves. They could not show a dead man to children. But the death was structural to the scene. There was no clean cut to make, no scary face to remove, no line of dialogue carrying the weight that they could simply redub. The body was the point, and the body was already there, blank-eyed and still. So they did the only thing the doctrine left available to them. They could not remove the death, so they faked life on top of it. The falling fork, which reads as the loosening of a hand in the moment of dying, was cut. And underneath the shot of the motionless, open-eyed, unmistakably dead man, someone laid in the faint sound of breathing. Say plainly what that required. A person sat in an edit suite, looked at a drawing of a corpse, and recorded or sourced the sound of human breath, and placed it beneath the corpse, so that children in their country would believe the dead man was alive. Not asleep even. The show gives no indication he is asleep, just breathing, a breathing body with the blank fixed eyes of the dead. The result, if you actually watch it with that knowledge, is far more unsettling than the original, because the original is just a death, and a death is a normal thing, and this is a dead man who appears to be breathing, which is the stuff of genuine nightmares. In trying to spare children a corpse, the censors manufactured something closer to a haunting, and this was not the only time they did it. There is a 2nd season episode called Skunked, in which a man who has been transformed into a were-skunk is finally cured, turns back into a human, says thank you, and collapses, dead. The dialogue that follows makes it perfectly clear that he has died. In the censored version, faint snoring was dubbed in over his collapse, the sound starting almost exactly as the camera leaves his body, to suggest that he has merely fallen asleep, even though everything around the moment confirms that he is not. The same technique, the same instinct, applied across years and across episodes. When the death cannot be cut, fake the breath, fake the snore. Put the sound of life over the image of death and hope no one looks too closely. This is the doctrine made physical, and it tells you exactly what the censors believed, far more clearly than any list of cut lines could. They believed that death was the one thing a child must never simply be allowed to see, not violence, which mostly survived, not the body, which they tolerated more than you would expect, death itself, the plain fact of a person being gone. They would rather lay a counterfeit breath over a counterfeit body than let a child look at a drawing and understand, quietly, that the man had died. The show kept saying, in its calm and physical way, that death is ordinary and survivable to witness. And the censors kept answering, with breath and with snoring and with a single changed word, that it absolutely is not, that it must be hidden at any cost, even the cost of making the dead seem to breathe. There is one more layer to this, and it is the layer that turns a collection of strange edits into a genuine pattern, almost a philosophy, because the censors were not really removing death from regular show. They could not. The deaths were structural, drawn into the frames, central to the plots. What they were removing, over and over, with enormous and almost obsessive care, was the word. Across the 5th season especially, you can watch this become a kind of ritual. In an episode called Guitar of Rock, a news anchor reports that a famous musician has died. The line in the censored broadcast was changed so that the icon had, instead, just stopped being alive. Stopped being alive. Said by all accounts, with the full gravity of a news anchor delivering tragic news, which makes the euphemism land as something close to absurd comedy, a man solemnly informing the nation that another man has stopped being alive. In an episode called Survival Skills, a character facing what looks like the end says, essentially, see you on the other side. The kind of thing a person says when they think they are about to die. That line was replaced with a strange substitute about probably dying of natural causes a long time from now, a line that makes no sense in the moment and only exists to avoid the immediacy of the original. In an episode called Catching the Wave, a character is described as dead and the word was changed to done, while other references to death in the same episode were left alone. And all the way back at the start, in Meet Your Maker, dead became unconscious. Look at what these edits share, and look at what they leave untouched. In every single case, the death remains. The icon still falls off the stage and is gone. The character still faces the end. The thing on screen is unchanged. What gets removed every time is the noun. The word dead. The word died. The plain naming of the thing. And here is the part that should change how you see the entire enterprise. You do not ban a word unless you believe the word has power. Nobody redubs a line, hires a voice actor, reanimates a mouth to match new dialogue, and ships a different version of an episode to an entire country in order to swap one neutral term for another. That level of effort is only spent on words that frighten the people spending it. So every one of these edits is, underneath, a confession. The censors believed that the word dead, spoken plainly on a children's show, was dangerous, which means the censors understood something about regular show that a great many of its casual viewers never quite articulated. They understood that death was not a passing theme in this show. They understood that it was the load-bearing beam. And they spent 8 years trying to take the weight off that beam one syllable at a time, because they could feel how much was resting on it. They were, in a strange way, the most careful readers the show ever had. They read it for danger, and they found the danger exactly where the show's deepest meaning lived. They just drew the opposite conclusion from the one the show was offering. The show said, look, death is ordinary. You can name it. You can survive seeing it. It can even be funny and kind. The censors said, no, the word alone is too much. Hide it, soften it, replace it. Fake a breath over it. And the comedy of their failure is that you cannot hide a thing by deleting its name while leaving the thing itself in full view. The dead man is still dead, whether you call him dead or done or unconscious or asleep. The picture says it. The picture always said it. All the censors managed to do in the end was draw a great deal of attention to the exact place where the show was telling the truth. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything so far has been about death arriving in the ordinary run of the show, woven into episodes that were ostensibly about something else. An arm wrestling match, a freezer of hot dogs, a restaurant. But once a year, every single year, regular show stopped weaving death into its stories and simply made death the whole story on purpose and called it a holiday. And it is in those episodes where the show abandons all pretense and puts its real subject directly in the center of the frame that the cutting became the most violent of all. The episodes are called Terror Tales of the Park, and there were several of them, one for most of the show's Halloweens. The first one arrived in the 3rd season, and it was notably the show's first half-hour special, a format the team was still figuring out. To the point where the segments had different production histories and were later split apart and reordered for reruns and streaming, something Quintel himself has gestured at over the years. The structure is an anthology, the characters tell each other scary stories, and the show acts the stories out. Which means, and this is the detail that makes the censorship almost surreal, that the deaths in these episodes are explicitly fiction inside the fiction. They are not canon. No one really dies. They are tall tales told for fun, framed by the show itself as not real. And the show used that frame to do the most gruesome things it ever did to its own cast. In a segment from the first special called In the House, the gang is picked off one by a malevolent force. Muscle Man is dragged off into the trees and comes back skinned. High Five Ghost is sucked bodily into a telephone and sprayed back out as ectoplasm. Benson is flushed down a toilet. Mordecai is thrown into a bookshelf. Pops is shoved into a closet that simply vanishes. One by one, the whole cast is killed. These are not the soft, weightless slapstick deaths the genre usually runs on. They are horror movie deaths, gruesome even without a single drop of blood, played for real scares, with body horror and jump scares and the specific cruelty of doing it to characters the audience has spent seasons loving. The version that aired in much of the world was carved up extensively. The loud gunshots from Muscle Man's shotgun as he is dragged into the trees were cut. The shot of him returning with his skin gone was cut. The spray of ectoplasm over the others when High Five Ghost is pulled into the foam was cut, and so was Benson's reaction to it. The moment of Mordecai being thrown into the bookshelf was cut, along with the shot of him climbing back out of it. In a different segment called Death Metal Crash Pit, there is a sequence showing exactly how a car gets sent flying into a pit. A cinder block dropped onto the brakes, and that was cut with the reasoning that it was too imitable, that it might teach a child how to make a car crash. So the censors were all at once cutting the gore, cutting the violence, and cutting the practical mechanics. Several different categories of caution applied to a single Halloween special whose entire and openly stated premise was that none of this was real. Then, 3 years later in the 6th season, came Terror Tales of the Park 4, and with it, the single clearest artifact of the two versions phenomenon that exists anywhere in the series. The American version of that episode ran the standard half hour, about 22 minutes with credits. The version that aired in the United Kingdom ran a little over 12. They cut roughly 10 minutes out of a 22-minute episode. They cut almost half of it. Look at how that was achieved, because it is staggering. The special has 3 stories. One, called The Hole, ends with Pops dying down a hole in the ground, and that death was edited. Another, called Unfinished Business, opens from the premise that Mordecai and Rigby are already dead, complete with a funeral, and proceeds into heavy body horror, ghost faces appearing in the backs of characters' heads, ghosts crawling into Benson's arm, and Benson himself dying by falling down a staircase. All of that was cut and trimmed and edited around, the jump scares removed, the body horror sanded off, Benson's death altered so that you see his ghost rise but never see the body it rose from. And then there is the third story, called Scary Movie Night, which was simply gone, not trimmed. Not softened, removed in its entirety, an entire roughly 9-minute segment lifted out of the episode as if it had never existed, leaving a clean cut from one story straight into the next. Think about what that means for a child who watched it. An entire country's children sat down to a Halloween special and watched a version with a third of its content surgically removed, a whole story missing, deaths edited into incoherence, and the overwhelming majority of them had absolutely no idea. They did not know there was a longer version. They did not know there was a story they never saw. They experienced a half-length, hole-riddled object and believed it to be the complete thing. That is the 2 versions of regular show in its most extreme and undeniable form, an episode that physically exists at 2 completely different lengths, the difference being almost entirely death. Here is the analysis that ties the Terror Tales to everything else. It would be easy to think of these specials as a departure, a once-a-year permission slip to be darker than usual. They are the opposite of a departure. They are the show being most fully itself. The rest of the year, regular show smuggles death into stories about hot dogs and arm wrestling, woven in so casually that you might miss how much of it there is. On Halloween, the show simply stops smuggling. It says, out loud, "This is what I have been about the whole time, and here is a half hour of it with the lid off." The Terror Tales are not the show putting on a costume. They're the show taking one off. And that is precisely why the cutting reaches its peak there. As long as the death was woven into other stories, the censors could chip at it, a word here, a shot there, a fork, a breath. But when the show dropped the disguise and made death the entire and explicit subject, the censors lost the ability to chip. There was nothing left to chip around. The death was not a moment inside the episode. The death was the episode. And so the only tool left to them was the knife, the wholesale removal of whole stories and whole minutes, which is why an entire country received a Halloween special with half of it missing. The show stopped hiding its subject, and the moment it did, the censors stopped being able to hide their reaction to it. The clearest picture of how much this show was about death is the size of the hole left in the episode where it admitted as much. The deaths in the Terror Tales were never even real. The show told you so every year with its little framing device of friends telling stories. And it was still too much. The fiction inside the fiction was still too much. That is how completely death saturates this show, that even its openly invented, explicitly non-canon, told for fun deaths had to be cut by 10 minutes to be allowed across a border. Before we go further, widen the lens for a moment, because death did not stand alone in this show, it stood in a crowd. And the company Death Keeps in regular show tells you why the censors could never fully separate it out. Look at what tended to get cut alongside the death in episode after episode, and a clear family resemblance appears. There is the drinking, which we have already met, the characters getting wasted on soda and hot wings, a workaround so beloved by the writers that they used it for years and so transparent that even the soda was sometimes too much for the censors. There is the innuendo, constant and cartoonish, lines about bodies and desire trimmed and redubbed across every season, and there is the violence, much of which survived, but plenty of which did not. In the show's Christmas special, a villain named Quilgan shoots Santa Claus out of his own sleigh, and Santa falls thousands of feet and is later found riddled with visible gunshot wounds. In much of the world, the shooting itself was cut, and Santa's wounds were painted out of the frames one by one, and a long line in which he describes having been shot and having fallen was trimmed down to almost nothing, so that in the censored version, Santa is simply, inexplicably, fine. In an episode called Firework Run, a villain charges in waving a golden machine gun, and the censors reanimated it into a handheld cannon, because a cannon was somehow gentler than a gun. In a third season episode called Slam Dunk, a shot lingering on the character Margaret as she rides a bicycle was so plainly about her body that the censors reanimated it and even recolored the entire background to sunset to disguise the change, so that the scene jumps from bright daylight to dusk and back in a way that makes the edit more obvious than the thing it was hiding. Now ask what all of these have in common: the death and the drinking and the innuendo and the violence. Because the answer is the same single thing, and it is the thing the censors were really fighting the entire time. They all insist that these characters have bodies. The drinking is a body taking in too much. The innuendo is a body wanting. The violence is a body that can be hurt. And death is the body finally and completely at its limit. Every one of these categories is the show saying, plainly and physically, that Mordecai and Rigby and Pops and Benson and the rest are not abstractions, that they eat and drink and want and bleed and end, that they are made of flesh in a way most children's cartoon characters are carefully not. That physicality is the show's entire texture. It is what makes the comedy land and what makes the deaths weigh something. And it is not located in any single removable line, which is exactly why the censors could never finish the job. You can cut a word, you can paint out a wound, you can recolor a sky, but you cannot reach into an episode and remove the fact that its characters have bodies, because the bodies are the show. Death was simply the largest and final fact about having a body, the one the censors found most unbearable. But it was never separable from the rest. To fully remove death from regular show, you would have had to remove the body, and to remove the body, you would have had to remove the show. This was, underneath everything, an adult comedy about being a person in a body, wearing the badge of a children's network. Quintel has all but said as much, marveling that it was ever approved, recalling being told to tone it down. The TV PGV rating was the network's own quiet admission of the gap, and every edit in every country was an attempt to make the badge true after the fact, to turn the adult thing into the children's thing it had been labeled as. The attempt was doomed from the start because the adulthood was never in the words or the wounds. It was in the show's whole posture toward life, the conviction that ordinary existence is physical and hungry and mortal and funny and a little disgusting, and that this is not a dark truth, but simply the truth. You cannot censor a posture. You can only keep cutting at its symptoms forever and never reach the thing itself, which is what the world did for 8 years and never finished. And nowhere is that posture clearer or more impossible to censor than in what the show eventually did with Death himself, because the show did not leave Death as a one-time villain from an arm wrestling episode. It brought him back again and again, and as it did something that no children's network on Earth could have known how to handle. It gave him a life. There is a third season episode called Dead at 8, and its premise is one of the warmest and strangest in the entire series. Death needs a babysitter. His regular sitter has canceled, and Death has a child, a son, and a wife, and an evening he needs to be elsewhere for, which happens to be the evening he has come to collect Muscle Man's soul as payment for a reckless stunt. So Death, the Grim Reaper, standing in the park to take a man's life, finds himself in the entirely ordinary bind of a working parent with no child care, and he makes Mordecai and Rigby a deal. If they will babysit his son and get the boy to bed by 8 o'clock, he will spare Muscle Man. They agree. They spend the episode doing what every babysitter in every story does, struggling with a difficult kid, improvising surviving the night, and at the end, having pulled it off, they receive from Death the highest compliment he can give. He tells them they are the best babysitters he has ever had. Read that scene through the eyes of the doctrine we have been tracing, and it becomes almost incomprehensible that it aired at all. This is not Death made scary. This is Death made domestic. Death has a marriage. Death has a kid who will not go to sleep. Death has the small, recognizable problems of any tired father trying to get out the door. The show takes the single most feared figure in the human imagination and gives him a family calendar and a childcare emergency, and the effect is not to make Death less powerful, but to make him less frightening, which is a completely different and far more radical thing. And the show kept doing it. In a 4th season episode called Last Meal, a prediction Death made earlier about Muscle Man's death comes true through, of all things, a hot dog eating contest, and Death decides to claim the soul he has been promised and challenges Muscle Man directly. But in the middle of the contest, Death looks over and sees Muscle Man and his girlfriend Starla kissing passionately in public. And the sight is so much for him that he throws up, and throwing up disqualifies him. And so Death, defeated not by strength but by his own disgust at a public display of affection, leaves in a huff and spares everyone. The embodiment of mortality undone by being grossed out at a couple making out. Across his appearances, the show builds him into a full character with real contradictions. He is genuinely cruel on the job, taking pleasure in collecting souls, laughing at people struggling, and he is also deeply honorable, never once breaking a bet, and he loves his wife and son without reservation, and he has a sense of humor, and a temper, and a gag reflex. He is, in short, a person. The show made Death a person. This is the deepest and most complete expression of the show's entire posture toward its real subject, and it is the thing the censors were ultimately helplessly fighting. Because the whole machinery of protecting children from death rests on a single hidden assumption, which is that death is terrifying. Every cut, every painted out wound, every breath dubbed over a corpse, every dead turned to done, all of it only makes sense if you begin from the belief that death is a horror that children must be shielded from. And regular shows simply did not begin from that belief. The show kept insisting, gently and persistently and for 8 years, that death was not a horror, that it was a working dad whose sitter flaked, that it was a guy you could beat at arm wrestling and then babysit for, that it was ordinary and survivable to witness, and even, at times, kind. To domesticate death is to disarm the fear of it, and disarming that fear was the one thing the censors could never permit, because preserving that fear was, whether they could have said so or not, the entire purpose of their work. So you arrive at the strange and almost sad irony at the center of all of this. The censors spent 8 years protecting children from the most comforting depiction of death a children's network ever aired. They treated as dangerous the one show that was not afraid. They cut and softened and euphemized and faked breath over bodies, all to shield children from a vision of death that was, of all things, reassuring. A vision that said the thing you are most afraid of has a family and a motorcycle, and a soft spot and will, in the end, do its job and ride away. They were guarding the fear, and the show, every time death appeared, was quietly trying to give children a way to set the fear down. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one more place the show hid death, and it is the least likely place imaginable, because it is inside the one character who cannot die at all. Skips is the steady one. In a cast of 2 slacker groundskeepers who break reality roughly once a week, a gumball machine for a boss, an immortal baby-faced gentleman, and a pair of disembodied hands and ghosts, Skips is the Yeti who keeps the park running. He fixes the cart. He fixes the supernatural. When the threat arrives that is too large for anyone else to handle, Skips is the one who already knows its name, because he has fought it before, somewhere, sometime, in a past the show only ever shows you in peace. He is voiced by Mark Hamill in a low and unhurried register that makes him sound like the calmest person in any room he enters, which is usually exactly what he is. Children watching the show learn to relax when Skips appears, the same way you relax when the competent adult finally walks into a chaotic situation. Skips means the problem is about to be solved. And he skips. Everywhere he goes, he skips a small loping hop across the lawn, across the house, down the road. The show never makes a production of it. It is simply a fact about him, the way a friend has a particular laugh or a particular walk, and for most of the series it functions as nothing more than a gentle visual joke. The big strong Yeti who skips, it is charming and it is a little funny, and it is the kind of detail you stop noticing because the show treats it as ordinary. For 5 seasons, the joke is just the joke. And then, in the 5th season, in an episode called Skips' Story, the show sits you down and explains the joke. And the explanation is one of the saddest things a children's network ever broadcast. The episode takes you back. Long before the park, the Yeti at the center of the story is not named Skips. His name is Walks. He is younger than, hot-tempered, the kind of teenager who gets expelled from school for fighting, and the year is 1814, and he arrives at a new school carrying all the anger of a young man who has not yet found anything worth being calm for. There he meets a group of students who are not what they appear to be. They call themselves the Guardians of Eternal Youth, led by one named Gareth, and they are immortal, a kind of secret student council that has existed for far longer than any school. They take Walks in. For the first time, the angry young Yeti has somewhere to belong. But the Guardians have a brother, one of their own, named Clorgbane, and Clorgbane was cast out, rejected for the cruelty in him, and Clorgbane wants revenge on everything the Guardians are. The Guardians look into what is coming, and they see that Walks, of all of them, is the one who can defeat Clorgbane if he can master a power they call the Fists of Justice. That is the adventure half of the story, the half with a prophecy and a villain and a chosen warrior. It is the kind of plot a children's cartoon can run in its sleep. But that is not the part of Skips' story that matters, and it is not the part the show actually cares about. Because while all of this is happening, Walks falls in love. Her name is Mona, Desdemona, fully, and she is bright and warm, and she sees something in the furious young Yeti that he cannot yet see in himself, and he becomes, around her, gentler. The show takes its time with them. It lets them be young and in love in the specific, quiet, unhurried way that the rest of the series almost never slows down enough to allow. There is a scene, a small and tender one, where she teaches him to be handy with tools. The two of them close together, patient, unguarded, the kind of intimate and ordinary moment that has nothing to do with prophecies or fists, and everything to do with two people who have decided they want to be near each other. It is the emotional center of the entire episode. It is the reason everything that follows lands the way it does. And it is one of the things international censors reached in and trimmed in some regions for reading as too suggestive. Hold that thought because it returns in a moment with a particular and awful symmetry. The story moves to a school dance, a prom. And in the middle of it, Clorgbane attacks. This is the moment Walks has been prepared for. The fight he was chosen to win, and so he does what the prophecy told him to do. He throws his punches. And nothing happens. The fists of justice do not come. His blows land and they do nothing at all, because he has not yet become the person who can wield them. And Clorgbane is bearing down, and the ceiling of the hall begins to come apart above them. And Mona, seeing what Walks does not see in time, pushes him out of the way. The ceiling comes down on her instead. The show lets her die. It does not soften it with a last-second rescue. It does not reveal that she survived. Mona is killed saving the life of the young man she loves, and it is in that exact instant, in the grief and the rage and the unbearable understanding of what has just happened, that the fists of justice finally answer. Walks becomes what he was always meant to become, far too late to matter for the only thing he wanted, and he strikes Clorgbane with the full force of the power he could not summon a moment earlier, and he punches him clean off the surface of the world and into space. And when the smoke clears and the fight is over and he has done the thing he was chosen to do, Walks looks down, and all that is left of Mona is her necklace, resting in his hand. That is the origin of the calmest character in regular show. Not a radioactive accident, not a destiny embraced, but a girl under a fallen ceiling and a necklace in an open palm. The Guardians come to him afterward. Clorgbane is not gone forever, they tell him. He will return, he always returns, on a cycle once every 157 years, and someone has to be there to meet him each time he does. And so they offer Walks immortality. They make him unable to die, not as a reward, but as a duty, so that he can fight the thing that killed the woman he loved, again and again, for as long as the universe keeps turning. He accepts, and then he changes his name. He is not Walks anymore, he cannot be. When the Guardians ask what name he wishes to carry into his endless new life, he thinks of her, and of the one small thing they used to do together in the brief happy stretch before the end. They used to skip. Side by side, on their dates, decorating the prom, two young people skipping through the ordinary joy of being in love. And so, of everything he could have chosen, he chooses that and makes it his name and his way of moving for the rest of forever. He becomes Skips, the hopping, loping, faintly ridiculous motion that the show plays for 5 seasons as a harmless quirk, the thing that makes children smile when the big Yeti bounces across the screen, is a man carrying the happiest thing he ever did with the woman he lost, performing it over and over for centuries, so that some small piece of her travels everywhere he travels. The gentlest running gag in the series is a vow of remembrance. Every single time Skips skips, he is keeping a promise no one else can see. Because he cannot die. Because he will never stop carrying her. Because that was the entire point. Sit with what that does to the rest of the show. The character children trust most, the one who always has the answer, is the one carrying the oldest and most permanent wound in the entire cast. His competence is not wisdom freely gained. It is the residue of having outlived everyone and everything, over and over across 2 centuries, while being forbidden by his own immortality from ever rejoining the one person he lost. His calm is not peace. It is the stillness of someone who has had a very long time to learn how to carry something he can never put down. The show handed children a comfort object and built it, secretly, out of bereavement, and then let it hop cheerfully across the lawn in nearly every episode for 7 years after. And now return to what the censors did. In some regions, they reanimated Mona's death, softening the moment of the ceiling, blunting the one event that gives Skips his entire meaning. And they trimmed the tender scene, the quiet closeness between Walks and Mona, for being too suggestive. Look at the shape of that choice, because it is the same backward shape the censors made everywhere else, only here it is at its cruelest. They were untroubled by the immortal warrior and the cosmic villain punched into the stars. What they reached for, what they decided children needed to be protected from, was the love. They left the loss and cut the reason the loss hurt. They kept the monument and chipped away at the thing it was a monument to. A child in one of those regions could watch Skip skip for years and never be given the full weight of why, because the tenderness that would have made his grief legible was the part deemed unsafe. There is a later episode in a much lighter key where Death himself threatens to reveal Skips' real name, the name Walks, as though it were a weapon, as though saying it aloud could wound him. And it could. Because it is not merely an old name. It is the name of the person he was before the ceiling came down, the last name he answered to while she was alive, and to speak it is to drag the whole dead world of 1814 back into the room. The show understood that a name can be a grave. It built an entire gag around the idea that the cruelest thing you could do to its kindest character was to make him hear who he used to be. So Skips is the proof of the thing this entire essay has been circling. The show did not need the character named Death in order to be about death. It took death and it folded it into the steadiest, safest, most reassuring figure it had, and it let that figure skip across the screen for 8 years, while almost every child watching understood him only as the nice Yeti who fixes things. You cannot censor Skips. There is no breath to dub over him, no wound to paint out, no word to swap. He is not a corpse on a car hood. He is the theme itself, alive and immortal and quietly grieving, hopping past the camera in scene after scene. And the censors who so carefully managed every visible body in the show never laid a finger on the saddest thing in it, because the saddest thing in it was smiling and waving and skipping, and it did not look like death at all. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. It helps to step back here and look directly at the episodes people usually mean when they say the words forbidden regular show, because they are not, for the most part, the ones this essay has been talking about. When fans trade stories about banned episodes, they tend to point at 2 in particular, and neither of them is about death at all. The first is a first season episode called The Unicorns Have Got to Go. The premise is exactly what the title promises. A group of unicorns turns up, and they are insufferable, arrogant, and loud and entitled, the kind of cool guy clique that ruins everything they touch, and Mordecai and Rigby spend the episode trying to get rid of them. It is a small, silly half of a season, one pairing, and it was pulled from the air in Poland, in Romania, and in Hungary. The honest thing to say about why is that the reasons for a ban in a specific country are very often never made public. And this is one of those cases where the cleanest answer is that an episode struck a nerve in certain markets and was quietly removed, without a detailed explanation attached. The episode that got yanked in 3 countries is, on its surface, a cartoon about obnoxious unicorns. The second is a 6th season episode called The Real Thomas. Thomas is a recurring character by that point, an intern around the park, a young goat who has been hanging around the cast for a whole season, and the episode reveals that Thomas is not who he has been pretending to be. He is an undercover agent, a spy, and the country running him is named, in the American version, as Russia. The episode was banned in Russia. And for international airings, the show went back and changed the country, replacing Russia with an invented nation called Druzhnia, so that the spy who had been working for a real and specific and politically delicate place was now working for a fictional one instead. A recurring character is unmasked as a foreign agent, the real-world nation is sanded off into a made-up one for the rest of the world, and the episode vanishes entirely in the country it named. So there are the famous forbidden episodes, a unicorn story and a spy story. And the reason they are useful here is not that they are about death, because they are not. The reason they are useful is the contrast. Look closely at what those 2 bands have in common. They are loud, they are total an entire episode removed, or an entire nation rewritten. They are rare, a handful of episodes across a run of 244, and they are local, inconsistent from one country to the next, tied to the specific political and cultural nerves of specific places, a unicorn that meant something in Warsaw, a spy that meant something in Moscow. These are the bands that come with a story attached, the ones fans can name, the ones that feel forbidden in the dramatic sense of the word. Now, set them beside everything this essay has actually been describing. The breath dubbed over the dead restaurant owner, the fork removed from his hand, the word dead turned into the word done, and the word done turned into the words just stopped being alive. The painted out gun wounds on Santa, frame by frame by frame, the skinned figure cut, the ceiling softened, the half-hour Halloween special quietly shortened to 12 minutes. None of that was loud. None of it came with a press release. None of it was rare, and none of it was local. It happened across essentially every major international feed, in market after market, season after season, from the first year to the last. It was not 3 episodes in 3 countries. It was a single subject handled the same careful way almost everywhere by people who never coordinated and never needed to, because they all flinched at exactly the same thing. And that is the tell. If you want to know what a culture is genuinely structurally afraid to show its children, you do not look at the one episode it pulled because of a passing political insult. You look at the subject that every market on Earth, independently and without discussion, agreed to quietly file down in every single season of the show. The unicorns and the spy were forbidden the way a particular joke is forbidden at a particular dinner table. Death was forbidden the way a whole word is forbidden in a whole language. One of those is a ban, the other is a taboo. And the forbidden regular show, the real one, was never about the episodes that got pulled. It was about the one thing that got cut from the episodes that stayed. Which raises a question this essay has been circling without quite asking directly. How did a show this soaked in death and grief and drunkenness ever get made at all? On a children's network? in the first place? And the answer is that the death was not smuggled in late, by accident by a writer's room that drifted dark over time. It was there at the root, by design from before the show even had its real name. Regular Show was created by a man named J.G. Quintel, and it grew out of his time as a young animator at Cartoon Network Studios, where it began life inside an incubator program for short cartoons known as the Cartoonstitute. Before that, it lived in his student films at the California Institute of the Arts, two strange and melancholy little shorts called 2 in the AM PM and The Naive Man from Lollyland. Hold on to that second title, because the name of that imaginary place, Lollyland, is going to matter enormously by the end of this story. Those student films already carried the tone the series would run on. That specific blend of the mundane and the cosmic, of dead-end jobs and apocalyptic stakes, of slacker boredom and sudden terrible beauty. The show was very nearly called something else entirely. For a while, the plan was to title it Normal Show before it became Regular Show, and even that small detail tells you something about the sensibility behind it. A sensibility fascinated by the word for ordinary, precisely because it intended to spend every episode breaking the ordinary open to show you what was underneath. A great deal of what was underneath came, by Quintel's own account, from British television. Through a roommate at art school, he absorbed a particular strain of British comedy, shows like The Mighty Boosh and The League of Gentlemen, and that lineage matters more than it might seem, because British comedy has a long and easy relationship with exactly the things American children's programming was most anxious about. Death, melancholy, the grotesque, the deadpan acceptance of awful things, the joke that sits 1 inch from genuine despair. That tradition does not treat mortality as an emergency to be kept off the screen. It treats it as material, as texture, as one of the ordinary facts of being alive that comedy is allowed to touch. Quintel imported that sensibility wholesale into an American children's network, and you can feel it in every frame where the show looks at a dead body without panicking, every moment where it lets a joke and a grave occupy the same shot. The comfort with death that defines Regular Show is, in part, a comfort with death inherited from a different country's idea of what comedy is for. The network seems to have understood at some level that it had something more adult than usual on its hands. Regular Show carried a rating of TV PG, and its more violent episodes were marked TV PGV, making it the first original animated comedy on the channel to wear that label. That is not a small administrative footnote. It is the network itself, in its own classification system, admitting that this particular cartoon was operating above the line its siblings stayed beneath. The show won a Primetime Creative Award and Emmy for Outstanding Short Format Animation in its early years, and the recognition only underlines the strangeness of the situation. A children's cartoon being honored for its craft while quietly conducting an 8-year meditation on death that half the planet was busy editing out. And here is the part that makes the whole thing click into place. In interviews given around the show's revival, decades after it started, the people who made it have been candid about the constant pressure they were under. The network, they have recalled, told them to tone it down. So they got clever. When they wanted their characters drunk, they could not show alcohol, so the characters got visibly, sloppily intoxicated on soda and on hot wings. The sugar and the spice standing in for the liquor the network would not allow, a workaround so transparent that everyone involved seems to have understood exactly what was being depicted. The creators have looked back at the finished show and asked, more or less, how it was ever greenlit, how any of it made it to air, how a children's network signed off on what they were actually doing. That disbelief is the key to everything, because it means there were always two forces inside Regular Show, pulling in opposite directions. There was the creative engine, raised on British melancholy, fascinated by the ordinary as a door into the cosmic and the mortal, constantly finding new ways to push death and drunkenness and grief and genuine darkness onto a children's channel. And there was the standards apparatus, the network notes, and the broadcast rules, constantly pushing all of it back out. The show that aired was the visible seam between those two pressures, the compromise line where what the creators smuggled in met what the watchdogs could catch. Soda for liquor, euphemism for the word dead, a joke laid carefully over a corpse so that the corpse could stay. Every clever workaround in the show is a record of that struggle, the creative side winning a few inches of forbidden ground and disguising the victory well enough to keep it. And the international censors, the ones who dubbed the breathing and painted out the wounds, were not some separate alien force descending on an innocent cartoon from outside. They were the exact same standards pressure, simply turned up louder, in markets where the rules were stricter and the tolerance was lower. The forbidden episodes were not an aberration. They were the second half of a tug-of-war that had been going on inside the show since the very first pilot, the watchdog side finally getting the reach and the scissors to undo the smuggling the creators had pulled off in America. So when those same creators sit down years later and marvel that any of it was ever allowed, What you are actually hearing is the winner of a long, quiet war finally describing the battlefield. They got death onto a children's network and kept it there for 8 years. The censors of the world spent those same 8 years trying to take it back. The forbidden regular show is simply the territory that changed hands in between. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. To understand the ending the show was building toward, you have to notice a pattern that runs underneath almost everything it ever did with death. A structural obsession the writers return to again and again, which is the eternal fight that never resolves. Think back to Skips. The reason he is immortal is not that immortality is wonderful. It is that Clorgbane returns on a cycle once every 157 years, and someone has to be standing there each time to meet him. Skips does not get to win once and be finished. He wins, and then he waits more than a century, and then he fights the same battle again, and then he waits, and then he fights, on, with no final victory available to him. Because the cycle is the point, and the cycle does not end. His immortality is a sentence of repetition. He is condemned to keep doing the same terrible thing forever, and the thing he is condemned to repeat is the very fight that took the woman he loved. There is no exit. There is only the next 157 years. Now hold that shape in your mind, the eternal recurring combat with no resolution, because the show is about to do it again, on a scale so much larger that it nearly stops making sense. When the finale finally reveals what Pops actually is, it tells you that he too is bound to a recurring fight. Not every 157 years, every 14 billion years, a cycle as long as the entire age of the universe. And like Skips, the fight never resolves. It has always ended in a stalemate, every single time. Across spans of time so vast that whole universes are born and die inside a single round. And the stalemate itself is what resets everything and starts the whole thing over. Pops has been fighting the same battle to the same draw for longer than there have been stars, with no more hope of a final ending than Skips has. Look at how the show nests these. A grief that repeats every 157 years, a human scale, a span a long-lived creature can actually feel passing, can actually dread. And inside the same fictional universe, a grief that repeats every 14 billion years, the literal lifespan of all reality, a cosmic scale that dwarfs every individual sorrow beneath it. Small loop inside enormous loop, the personal tragedy of one Yeti folded inside the structural tragedy of existence itself. And at every scale, large and small, the show is telling you the exact same thing. The horror is not the fighting. The horror is that it never stops. The horror is the immortality, the recurrence, the eternal return of the same pain with no release built into it anywhere. And this is the thing the censors never understood about the show they were editing, because it is the precise inversion of everything they believed. The people dubbing breath over corpses operated from a single unspoken premise, that death is the worst thing that can happen, the outcome to be prevented at all costs, the horror from which children must be shielded. But regular show does not believe that death is the worst thing. Regular show believes the worst thing is to be unable to die. Skips cannot die, and so he can never rejoin Mona, never lay the grief down, never reach an end. Pops cannot resolve his fight, and so reality itself is trapped in an endless loop of being destroyed and rebuilt. 14 billion years at a time, going precisely nowhere forever. In the moral universe of this show, immortality is the curse, and the cycle is the prison, and death, real death, permanent death, is the only thing in all of creation powerful enough to break either one. That is the engine the entire finale runs on. The show spent 8 years quietly teaching its audience that the eternal fight is the true nightmare, so that when the ending finally arrives and offers death as the way out, death does not read as a horror at all. It reads as a release. It reads as the only mercy available. The censors were guarding the exit and calling it the danger. They spent a decade protecting children from the one thing the show had carefully positioned as salvation. There is a second piece of groundwork the show laid just as patiently, and it concerns not the moment of dying, but what the show keeps suggesting comes after it. Most children's television, on the rare occasions it touches death at all, treats it as a wall. A character is gone, and gone means absent, an empty chair, a closed door, nothing beyond it that the camera will look at. Regular show treats death over and over as a threshold instead. Consider that the character of death is not a void or an abstraction, but a working professional with a home and a family, a wife and a son, a domestic life that exists entirely on the far side of dying. The show casually establishes that there is a there, an ongoing existence beyond the end that has its own routines and its own relationships. A place where the business of the dead is conducted by someone who then goes home to his kid. Death is not the edge of the map in this show. Death is a country with residents. Consider, too, how often dying turns out to be a crossing that can be recrossed. When Rigby is killed and his soul is in Death's hands, the show does not treat that as the unalterable end. It treats it as a place his friends can travel to, bargain at, and bring him back from. The boundary is real enough to be frightening, but it is a boundary that can be approached and, sometimes, with enough love and enough stubbornness, walked back across. The show keeps insisting that the line between the living and the dead is a line, an actual place with two sides, and not simply the falling off point of everything. All of that quiet groundwork exists so that the very last thing the show ever shows you will land with its full weight. Because the series does not end on a death. It ends on the far side of one. It ends by doing the thing it spent 8 years preparing you to accept, by simply pointing the camera past the threshold and letting you see that someone is still there. And against that, the censors were nearly powerless because their whole toolkit was built for the visible surface of death, the corpse and the wound and the word. You can dub breathing over a body. You can paint out a bullet hole. You can change the word dead to the word done. But you cannot censor a metaphysics. You cannot edit out the show's deepest and least visible claim, the one it makes not in any single shot but in the accumulated shape of 8 years, the claim that death is a doorway and that something continues on the other side of it. That claim was never on the surface where the scissors could reach. It was in the architecture, and the finale is where the architecture finally becomes the whole point. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Regular show ended on the 16th of January in 2017 with a 3-part finale called a regular epic final battle, running across roughly 33 minutes in total, and it drew the largest audience of the show's entire final season. More than 1.25 million people gathering to watch a slacker comedy about a blue jay and a raccoon say goodbye. They came for an ending. What the show gave them was the most complete statement of its real subject it had ever made, an ending built from its first frame to its last, entirely out of death, and allowed, for once, to stay exactly that. To explain why the finale lands the way it does, the show finally has to tell you what Pops is, and the reveal recontextualizes the entire series. Pops Maillard, the round-faced, lollipop-headed gentleman in the top hat who has spent 8 seasons being the show's purest source of innocence and delight, the one character who greets every catastrophe with childlike wonder, who is too kind and too guileless to register cruelty even when it is aimed directly at him, is not a man at all. He is a cosmic being. He was born on a faraway world named Lollyland, and that name should ring like a bell for anyone who knows where the show came from, because Lollyland is the very place G. Quintel invented years earlier for his student film about a naive man, the naive man from Lollyland. The most innocent character in regular show carries, as his birthplace, the name of his creator's earliest imagined world. The naive man from Lollyland grew up to become the secret heart of the whole series. And Pops, it turns out, is one half of something. He is a deity of pure good, and at the moment of his birth, the universe, requiring balance, produced his exact opposite, a twin of pure evil, Anti-Pops. The two of them are not simply enemies, they are the two poles of existence itself, good and its negation, and they are locked together in a fight that does not belong to human time at all. They battle once every 14 billion years, a span as long as the age of the universe, and every time they fight, the result is the same. Neither wins. It ends in a perfect stalemate, and that stalemate is so total, so absolute, that it annihilates everything and resets the universe back to its beginning, and the whole cosmos starts over, and grows again, and eventually the two of them are born again to fight again to the same draw, forever. This is the largest version of the loop the show has been obsessed with all along. Skip's fighting Clorgbane every 157 years was the small, human-scaled rehearsal. This is the full cosmic score, an eternal recurring battle with no resolution, destroying and remaking all of reality, going nowhere, endlessly. So the stakes of the finale are not really whether good defeats evil. The stakes are whether the cycle can finally be broken, whether anyone can do the one thing that has never been done in the entire history of existence, which is to make this fight end. And here is where the show makes its quietest and most radical decision, because the obvious way to break a cycle of combat, the way nearly every story would choose, is for good to finally, decisively win the fight, to land the blow that the previous infinite iterations never managed, to beat evil at last. Regular show refuses that. It understands, with the moral clarity it spent 8 years hiding inside fart jokes in arcade games, that you cannot break a cycle of violence by winning it, because winning it is just another move inside the cycle. And the cycle is built to absorb victories and defeats alike and reset regardless. The only way out is not to play. And so Pops, faced with his evil twin in what should be the climactic brawl of the universe, faced with the chance to finally throw the punch that ends everything, does something else entirely. He learns that Anti-Pops has a weakness, and the weakness is not a vulnerable spot or a secret weapon. The weakness of pure evil in this show is goodness itself. Anti-Pops cannot withstand the one thing he was created to be the absence of, and the form that goodness takes, the specific gesture that can undo the embodiment of all malice, is a hug, not a blow, an embrace. Sit for a moment with how strange and how brave that is on a children's network at the climax of an 8-year story, with more than 1 million people watching. The universe has been trapped in an infinite war since before time, and the way the war ends is that the good one stops fighting and holds the evil one. That is the whole solution. Love, expressed as the refusal to strike, as the willingness to draw close to the thing you were made to oppose and simply embrace it. It is the most direct possible repudiation of the entire logic of combat the show had been staging for years. The fists of justice, the soul stakes arm wrestling, the cosmic stalemate, all of it answered, finally, by a hug. But there is a price, and the show does not pretend there is not. Because for the hug to work, for the cycle to truly break, Pops cannot simply embrace his brother and walk away. The two of them, good and evil, the matched poles of all existence, have to go together. Pops takes hold of Anti-Pops, and he lifts them both off the ground, and he carries his evil twin up and away from everyone he loves, away from the park and the friends, and the whole small, ordinary world the show has spent 8 years making you care about. And he flies the two of them directly into the sun. He kills them both. He ends the cycle the only way it can be ended, by removing both poles from the board at once, good and evil extinguished together in the same fire, and he does it deliberately, knowingly, choosing it. Pops, the most innocent being in the entire show, the naive man from Lollyland, performs the single most knowing act in the series. He understands exactly what breaking the cycle will cost, and the cost is himself, and he pays it without hesitation, because the alternative is 14 billion more years of the same, again and again, forever. He trades his own existence for the freedom of everyone and everything that will ever live afterward, and the last thing his goodness does, the final expression of the purest good in the universe, is to die on purpose so that the endless war can stop. That is the death the show built for 8 years, and it is the one death of all the deaths in all of regular show that no censor anywhere undid. Think about everything you have heard in this essay about how carefully the show's deaths were managed elsewhere. A restaurant owner collapses on the hood of a car, and somewhere far away a sound editor records the noise of breathing and lays it under his body so that children will not understand he is dead. A villain shoots Santa Claus out of the sky, and an editing team paints over the wounds one frame at a time so that no child sees the blood. A worse skunk dies in the woods, and the corpse is given the sound of snoring. The word dead becomes the word done. The word done becomes the phrase just stop being alive. Across 8 years in dozens of countries, an enormous, patient, frame-by-frame effort went into making sure that the deaths in regular show were softened, blurred, dubbed over, or quietly renamed so that the youngest viewers would be spared the plain fact of them. And then Pops flies into the sun, and nobody touches it, no breathing is dubbed over the moment, no wound is painted out, because there is no wound to hide, only a deliberate and total self-erasure. The word death is not swapped for a gentler word, because the death is not a stray line that can be rewritten, it is the structure of the entire episode, the meaning the whole finale exists to deliver. There is no edit that can make Pops' sacrifice not a death, because his death is the point, the whole point, the thing the show spent 244 episodes building the muscle to finally say out loud. You cannot dub breathing over a climax. You cannot trim the load-bearing beam out of a story and have the story stand. The censors who undid every small and incidental death the show ever staged were in the end completely powerless against the one enormous central death it had been preparing all along, because that death was no longer hideable. It had become the architecture itself. And that is the deepest irony in this entire story. For 8 years, the show smuggled death in around the edges, in the corpse on the car, and the wounds on Santa, and the dead were skunk. And for 8 years, the censors caught it at the edges and sanded it down. But the show was never really hiding death at the edges. It was building it at the center, slowly, where no scissors could reach, until the finale, where it placed the largest death it had ever staged in the one position from which it could not be removed. The forbidden regular show won in the end. It got to tell the truth about dying on a children's network, in front of more than 1 million people, with the network's blessing. And the truth it told was that the purest good imaginable proves itself by choosing to die for the sake of everyone left behind. But the show is not finished because it has one more thing to show you, and it is the thing it spent 8 years quietly earning the right to show. Having killed its gentlest character, the series does not fade to black on the empty space where he was. It does the thing children's television almost never does. It follows him. The finale's final passage takes you to the afterlife, to a peaceful sunlit somewhere on the far side of death. The place all that earlier groundwork promised was there, the country with residents, the doorway with another side. And there is Pops, not gone, not erased, not an empty chair, but present, whole, at rest, exactly the gentle figure he always was, somewhere beyond the end. The show simply points its camera past the threshold and lets you see that he continues. And after 8 years of insisting that death in this universe is a line and not a wall, it keeps its promise and shows you the other side of the line with its most beloved character standing peacefully upon it. And what is Pops doing in the afterlife in the last moments of the series? He is watching a tape. There is a video cassette, and on its label is written the words, "Regular show," and Pops is watching it. Watching the very thing you have been watching, the whole series folded into a single object resting in the hands of the character who gave his life to end it. He is watching his own show from beyond his own death. And when it is over, gently, calmly, with no distress at all, he reaches out and ejects the tape. He stops it himself. The act of ending the show is given in the final seconds to the character who already performed the ultimate ending. And he does it the same way he did everything. Softly, contentedly, without fear. And he speaks the last words of the entire series, his own old catchphrase, the small contented phrase he has murmured for 8 years whenever something delighted him. Jolly good show. The series' final line is a benediction, spoken from the far side of death, by a character who is at peace, blessing the very thing that is ending. All of it set to music, and the music matters because the song the finale chooses is David Bowie's Heroes, a song about being heroic only for a single day, about a triumph that is real precisely because it is fleeting, precisely because it does not and cannot last forever. That is the exact opposite of the endless cycle Pops died to break. The eternal fight offered forever and delivered nothing. Pops chose the single day, the mortal triumph, the heroism that ends, and the show scores his death and his peace with a song that says, "The thing worth being is a hero just for one day, a thing that is beautiful because it is finite." The cycle promised eternity and was a prison. Death offered an ending and turned out to be the only freedom. And the song knows it, and the show knows it, and Pops, switching off the tape with a smile, knows it most of all. The show has one last quiet truth to tell, and it tells it in the epilogue in the years that pass after the great battle is won. Because winning the cosmic war does not exempt anyone from ordinary dying, and the show, faithful to its real subject right up to the final minutes, does not pretend that it does. Time moves forward, the world goes on, and Pops' father, Mr. Myalard, the actual owner of the park, an old man through the entire series, dies the way old men do, quietly of age, often the passage of time, without a cosmic battle or a flight into the sun, just the plain ordinary end that comes for everyone eventually. The show that spent 8 years being censored for the word dead closes its story with 2 deaths, the vast mythic sacrifice of a cosmic deity, and the small, unremarkable passing of an elderly man, placed side by side given equal dignity, neither one hidden. And in the far epilogue, a reunion a quarter of a century later, when the surviving characters gather again as middle-aged versions of themselves, the show lets you see how they chose to remember. There are statues, one of Pops, and one of Mr. Maillard, the god who died to save everything, and the old man who simply grew old and stopped, standing in stone together, both gone, both honored, both real. The Forbidden Regular show told the truth about dying in its first season, when a restaurant owner went blank-eyed on the hood of a car, and it was still telling the truth about dying in its last, with 2 statues of 2 dead men and a beloved character switching off the tape from heaven. It never once flinched. The censors flinched for 8 years in dozens of countries, frame by frame. The show never did. There is a way of seeing the whole thing now, from the far side of the finale, that pulls every scattered edit into a single clear shape. And it begins with the strangest detail in all of it, the one this essay opened on, the breathing dubbed over a corpse. Consider what actually has to happen for that edit to exist. Somewhere, in a room far from the people who made the show, an editor sits with a shot of a man lying dead across the hood of a car. And before that editor can do anything, the editor has to look at the shot and understand it. The blank eyes, the slack body, the stillness, the falling fork, all of it has to register, has to be read correctly, as death. The editor has to arrive at the same instant conclusion the youngest child in the audience would arrive at, which is that this man is dead. Only then, having understood it completely, does the editor decide to act, and the action is to find the sound of breathing and lay it underneath the body. You do not add breath to a shot unless you have already concluded that the shot, left alone, reads unmistakably as death. The edit is only possible because the thing it is trying to hide has already been seen and understood by the person hiding it. Which means every one of those edits is a confession. The breathing over the corpse, the snoring over the dead or skunk, all of it is a signed admission, in the censor's own hand, that the censor saw the death plainly, understood that the audience would see it too, and moved specifically to counteract that understanding. The censors were not confused about what regular show was doing. They could not have made these particular edits if they had been confused. The precision of the cover-up is proof of the clarity of the recognition. They knew exactly what was there. That is why they reached for the breath. And look at what they reached for, because it tells you everything about what they could and could not do. They did not, in most of these cases, remove the death. They did not reanimate the restaurant owner into a living man, did not redraw the body sitting up, did not cut the corpse from the episode. The body stays. The death, as an event, as a fact on the screen, mostly remains. What they altered was the signal, the small cues that name the death as a death, the sound, the falling fork, that tiny detail of a hand going limp, snipped out while the body it belongs to remains in frame. The word, dead, turned to done, the label peeled off the thing while the thing itself sits there unchanged. Over and over across every market and every season, the censors went after the language of death, the audio and the vocabulary and the smallest visual signifiers, and left the substance of death sitting right where the show had put it. That is the method once you see it, and it never varies. They could not remove the deaths because the deaths were too woven in, too structural to cut without the episodes collapsing, so they attacked the periphery instead. They muffled the cues. They swapped the words, they painted over the wounds while leaving the shooting, dubbed the breath while leaving the body, snipped the fork while leaving the corpse. The entire apparatus of censorship in dozens of countries across 8 years amounts to a sustained attack on the signifiers of a thing they could not touch the substance of. And there is no more complete admission than that. You only bother muffling the signal of something you have already failed to remove. The censors spent a decade unable to take death out of regular show, and so they settled for trying to make it quieter. And the record of that settling, the breath and the fork and the swapped word, is the clearest possible evidence that death was the immovable core they kept failing to move. And this is the point where someone watching has every right to raise an objection, because death was not the only thing the show got censored for, and this essay has admitted as much all along. The drinking was edited heavily, the alcohol turned to soda, the intoxication explained away. The innuendo was trimmed, the suggestive moments cut, the bike scene reanimated into a sunset. The violence was softened, the crotch kicks turned to ordinary punches, the imitable stunts removed. So why death? Why claim that death, of all the forbidden things in regular show, is the real one, the central one, the true subject, when drinking and sex and violence were all sitting right there getting cut alongside it? The answer is in the difference between being censored and being load-bearing, and once you draw that line, death stands alone on the far side of it. Start with structure. The drinking in regular show is a gag. It is funny, it is recurring, it is a clever workaround with soda standing in for liquor, but you could remove every drunken scene from the series, and the series would still be the series, still be about the same things, still mean what it means. The innuendo is texture, a layer of adult winking laid over a children's cartoon, and you could sand all of it off and lose some jokes, but no substance. The violence is style, the visual vocabulary of an action comedy, and softening it changes the texture but not the spine. None of these things is the skeleton. You can edit all of them and the body still stands. Death you cannot remove, because death is the skeleton. Take it out and there is no skips, no immortal Yeti grieving a girl under a fallen ceiling, no reason he hops across the lawn. There is no death, no recurring character riding his motorcycle to collect souls and going home to his wife and son. There is no over-the-top, no arm wrestling for a friend's soul. There is no finale, no cosmic deity choosing to die to end an eternal war. No statue, no tape switched off from heaven. Strip the death out of regular show and the whole thing falls down. Because the death was never decoration. It was the load-bearing beam the entire structure rested on. The drinking and the innuendo and the violence were things the show did. Death was the thing the show was about. Then look at the censors' own behavior because they told on themselves here too. For the drinking, they found a substitution, soda for liquor, and moved on. For the violence, they swapped one action for another, a punch for a kick, and moved on. These are ordinary edits, the routine adjustments of broadcast standards, the same moves made to countless cartoons. But for death, and for death alone, they invented something genuinely strange. They recorded the sound of a living human breathing and laid it over a body. They found snoring and placed it on a corpse. No equivalent bizarre effort exists for the drinking or the violence. Nobody performed an act that peculiar to soften a punch. That specific weirdness, that willingness to do something no standards manual would ever describe, marks death as the special case, the one subject that pushed the censors past their ordinary toolkit into improvisation. You do not invent a strange new technique for a routine problem. You invent it for the thing that frightens you most, the thing the routine tools cannot manage. And finally, look at where each thing ended up. The drinking stayed a gag to the very end, the innuendo stayed texture, the violence stayed style. But death climbed over 8 years from the edges of the show to its absolute center until it became the entire substance of the finale, the meaning the whole series had been building toward. The one thing placed in the one position from which no censor could remove it. Among all the forbidden subjects in regular show, death is the only one that is simultaneously the most heavily censored and the most deeply central. The others were censored. Death was censored and load-bearing both, censored precisely because it was load-bearing, fought hardest because it mattered most. That is what makes it the real forbidden subject, and not merely one forbidden subject among several. It is the one the show was built out of, and the one the censors could feel was different, even when they could not have said why. There is one more turn to follow before the screen goes dark, because the softening of regular show was not only something done to it abroad, it was, more quietly, something its own home did to it as well. As the show grew more popular through its early years, around its third and fourth seasons, the network in the United States went back and revisited some of its older episodes, and it cleaned them. Words that had slipped through the first time were swapped for milder ones. The word crap became the word crud. The word pissed used to mean angry became ticked or miffed. The word moron became idiot. None of those is death, and that distinction matters because it sharpens the point rather than blunting it. The American version largely kept its deaths. The corpse on the car hood kept its silence in America. What the home network reached back to sand down was the smaller material, the mild profanity, the rough edges that a more cautious later moment had decided the earlier looser show should not have had. But notice what the existence of that domestic cleaning actually proves. It proves the softening reflex was never some foreign strangeness imposed from outside by distant and unfamiliar standards. It lived at home too. The same nervous impulse that turned up loud in other countries would dub breath over a corpse, lived in a quieter form in the show's own backyard, going back through old episodes to tidy the language. The difference between the American version and the versions the rest of the world saw was never a difference of kind. It was only a difference of degree, of how far the same impulse was permitted to reach. At home, it reached the word crap. Abroad, it reached the word dead, and then the corpse itself, and then the breath. The same hand pressing harder the farther it traveled from the people who made the show. And that means there were never simply two versions of regular show. There was a whole spectrum of them, a gradient of caution running from the relatively intact American broadcast at one end to the heavily softened international feeds at the other. The show growing quieter and gentler and less honest about death the farther out along that gradient you went. A child in one country grew up with a show in which a man on a car hood was plainly dead. A child in another grew up with the identical man in the identical shot, breathing faintly alive by the grace of a sound effect. They watched what they each believed was the same series. They were not. They were each handed a different point on the gradient, calibrated to how much their particular corner of the world had decided a child could be allowed to learn about dying. This is the part that gives the whole subject its strange and lasting pull, and it is the reason a topic like this one can hold a long and quiet night of telling, because for years, none of those children knew. The child in the country with the breathing corpse had no way of knowing that somewhere else the same corpse lay silent. The edited version was simply the show, the only show they had, complete and seamless and apparently whole. The softening was invisible precisely because it was done so well, the breath laid in cleanly, the fork removed without a seam, the word swapped so smoothly that nothing seemed to be missing at all. You cannot notice the absence of a thing you were never shown. An entire generation across much of the world grew up on a regular show in which the dead quietly breathed and almost no one ever said the word dead, and they grew up believing that was the show, the whole of it, exactly as it had been made. And then they grew up the rest of the way, and the internet arrived in their adult lives, and people from different countries began comparing the cartoons of their childhoods. And somewhere in those comparisons, the seams finally started to show. Someone who grew up with the silent corpse mentioned it to someone who grew up with the breathing one, and a small confusion bloomed, and then a search, and then a discovery. The forbidden regular show, as a phenomenon, as a thing people build videos and pages and long threads around, is in large part that discovery happening over and over again, a generation slowly realizing that the show they were given was not the show that was made, that something had been done to it on the way to them, that there existed a version with the deaths left whole and they had never once been allowed to see it. The fascination is not really about cursed tapes or lost episodes, whatever the mythology around it sometimes suggests. It is about something far more ordinary and far more affecting, which is the particular ache of learning that the story of your own childhood was edited before it reached you, and that the thing edited out, of all the things it could have been, was the truth about death. That is why the forbidden episodes haunt people the way they do. Not because they are frightening, because they are honest, and because their honesty was taken away so gently and so thoroughly that the people it was taken from did not even know to miss it, until decades had passed. There is a specific and quiet vertigo in it. The experience of an adult sitting down to rewatch the cartoon they loved as a child, and hearing for the first time the faint sound of breathing under a body they had always understood, somehow, was a body, and realizing in that instant what the sound is and what it was always for. It is the sound of someone, long ago, deciding you could not be trusted with the truth, and hearing it as an adult, finally able to recognize it for the cover-up it is to catch the confession in the act, years too late, in the soundtrack of your own childhood. It also turns the word forbidden completely inside out. Forbidden is supposed to mean dangerous. It is supposed to mark the thing that is harmful, corrupting, unsafe, the thing kept from you for your own protection. But the forbidden regular show was none of those things. The version that was withheld, the version with the deaths intact, was not the dangerous one. It was the honest one. It was the kind one. It was the version that knelt down and told children the truth, gently, and trusted them to carry it. What was forbidden, in the end, was not horror. What was forbidden was candor and tenderness, and the radical idea that a child could look at death and not be destroyed by it. The most honest version of the show became the most forbidden version of the show, and those two facts are not a coincidence. The one was the cause of the other. It was forbidden because it was honest. There is no more complete summary of the whole strange story than that. So here, at the end of all of it, is what the forbidden regular show actually turns out to be. For 8 years, there were two versions of this show. There was the one that was made in America by a small group of animators raised on British melancholy and given just enough room by their network to smuggle the truth onto a children's channel. And there was the other one, the one most of the world actually saw. The version that arrived in the United Kingdom and Australia and the Philippines and New Zealand and across Latin America with the breath dubbed in and the wounds painted out and the word dead quietly replaced. Two shows, the same in nearly every frame, different in the one way that mattered. And if you lay them on top of each other, if you line up every single point where the second version diverges from the first, every cut and every dub and every swapped word, and you ask what subject those divergences cluster around, the answer is not drinking, and it is not innuendo, and it is not violence, though all of those were touched. The answer, overwhelmingly, relentlessly in country after country and season after season, is death. The map of everything the world was not allowed to see is, more than anything else, a map of dying. That is the forbidden regular show. Not a lost episode. Not a cursed tape. Just the ordinary show with the deaths left in, which turned out to be too honest for almost anywhere on Earth to broadcast unaltered. And the strangest, saddest thing about it is what the show was actually trying to do with all that death the censors fought so hard to soften. Because it was never being cruel. It was never trying to frighten children or scar them or expose them to horror for its own sake. Look again at what it actually built. It built a death who is a working dad with a wife and a son and a sitter who flaked, a death you could beat at arm wrestling and then babysit for, a death who loses his nerve at the sight of a couple kissing. It built a Skips whose grief is so old and so deep that it turned into the gentlest gag in the show, a sad man hopping across a lawn for 8 years so that children would have someone steady to trust. It built a finale where the purest good imaginable proves what it is by choosing to die for everyone it loves, and then it followed that good soul past the threshold and showed you that it was at peace, contented switching off its own story with a smile. Every one of those is a kindness. Every one of those is the show kneeling down to a child and saying, gently, that the thing you are most afraid of is not a monster, that it has a family, that it can be survived, witnessed, even loved. That something continues. The show was not trying to terrify children with death. It was trying to disarm their terror of it. And that, in the end, is the thing the censors could never allow, and the reason the whole machinery of softening existed. because every cut they made rested on a single buried assumption. The assumption that death is a horror from which children must be shielded, that the fear of it is correct and necessary and must be preserved at all costs. And regular show simply did not share that assumption. The show kept insisting patiently for 8 years that the fear could be set down. And so the two of them were never really fighting over corpses or wounds or words. They were fighting over the fear itself. The censors were guarding it, frame by frame, in dozens of countries. The show, every time death rode in, every time skips hopped past, every time it pointed its camera past the threshold, was quietly trying to take that fear out of a child's hands and replace it with something softer. The Forbidden Show was the one that was not afraid, and being unafraid on the subject of death, in front of children, was the one thing that could not be permitted. Which brings it back, finally, to the two images this essay has been holding the whole time, the two bodies that bookend the entire story. At the beginning, there is a man lying back across the hood of a car, dead, his eyes open and empty, a fork slipping from his hand, and somewhere far away, someone decided that children could not be allowed to understand what they were seeing, and so they took the sound of a living person breathing and laid it underneath him. And they cut the falling fork, and they forced a corpse to keep breathing. That is the first body, a death the censors could not accept, dressed up in the sounds of a life it no longer had, a man not permitted to be dead because somebody decided a child could not bear it. And at the end, there is Pops, not on a car hood, but in a sunlit afterlife, not faked into false breathing, but genuinely permanently gone, having chosen his own death to break the oldest war in the universe, and entirely at peace with it. He sits and watches the tape of his own show, the whole story he was the secret heart of, and when it is finished, he reaches out calmly, contentedly, and ejects it. He stops it himself. A death the show was finally allowed to let stand, a character permitted to be gone, switching off his own story without fear and murmuring that it was a jolly good show. That is the second body. And it is everything the first one was not. The first was a death denied, papered over with borrowed breath. The second is a death accepted, blessed even, by the one who died, set to a song about how the things worth being are the things that do not last. That is the distance regular show traveled, and the distance the censors spent 8 years trying to prevent it from traveling. From a corpse forced to breathe to a soul at peace switching off the tape. From a death a child was not allowed to see to a death a child was finally allowed to understand. The show began with a body the world insisted on keeping artificially alive, and it ended with a body the show was permitted to let go, and in between it did the slow, patient, forbidden work of trying to teach children that the second kind of death, the accepted kind, the peaceful kind, was not the thing they should be afraid of. The people who dubbed the breathing thought they were protecting children from death. What they were actually doing was protecting children from comfort, from the one show on the channel that had something genuinely gentle to say about the hardest fact there is. They guarded the fear and called it safety, and the show every single time in every episode they cut was trying to hand children the opposite, a way to look at a body on the hood of a car, or a man flying into the sun, or a yeti hopping across a lawn, and feel, instead of terror, something quieter and kinder and truer. The forbidden regular show was never dangerous. It was only honest, and it was only kind, and for 8 years across most of the world, that was apparently far too much to allow. It is, in its own strange way, the most fitting ending the show could have had. A series that was censored for the word dead from its very first season closes on a beloved character who is dead, at peace, and content switching off the very story you have been watching. The show got the last word. It got to tell the truth about dying in front of more than 1 million people with no breath dubbed over it and no wound painted out, and the truth it told was the same truth it had been trying to tell all along in every scene the world tried to soften. That death is not a monster, that it can be met, that something perhaps continues, and that the bravest thing a children's show ever did was to sit a child down, gently, and refuse to lie to them about it. The tape ejects. The screen goes quiet. Pop smiles, somewhere on the far side of everything, and the forbidden regular show, the honest one, the kind one, the one most of the world was never quite allowed to see, finally comes to rest. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next conteúdo do proyecto Velvo criado por você adicione PDFs, documentos o otros textos para usar como referencia neste proyecto.